Hello, I'm Kathy Fox Alfano, host of Born TV's Primary 22, Why Should We Vote for You? Today, I'm welcoming Quentin Palfrey, Democratic candidate for Attorney General. Running in the primary on September 6th, yes, the day after Labor Day. Quentin, thank you so much for coming down to Bourne, although your parents live here on the Cape, so I know you already love it, and you'll do everything you can to help us here on Cape Cod.
Absolutely. This is one of my favorite places to be. As you mentioned, my parents live right up the street in Katamet, and so this is a very special place for me.
Great. So we'd really like to get to know you better. First, Quentin, just tell me, what does the Attorney General do?
Well, the Attorney General is the people's lawyer, and the Attorney General has a large number of responsibilities, but one of the things that I find so exciting about the office is both the ability to handle individual problems and also to take on really big challenges. So I was an Assistant Attorney General. I was the first chief of the healthcare division in the Attorney General's office at the time that we were implementing Massachusetts health reform. We had a hotline within our division, and we would take complaints from people who were having trouble accessing their health care, having trouble with their insurance companies or pharmaceutical companies, and we helped them to resolve those problems. And sometimes we had to bring lawsuits on behalf of those consumers. So one thing that kept happening over and over again is we kept hearing that people were being lied to by insurance salespeople, that they were being told that they would get good coverage and then they'd get cancer or some other problem, and those treatments wouldn't be covered by their insurance. So we sued some of those companies and brought a couple of years worth of litigation. And at the end of all that, we got big recoveries for consumers and kicked 3 of the worst actors out of Massachusetts. Wow. And I think it's a good example of what the Attorney General can do. We saw recently the AG taking on Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family, whose lies really contributed to this opioid crisis.
Yeah, it's awful. What other experiences you have that we need in our Attorney General?
Yeah, so I think that my experience as a government lawyer is one of the things that sets me apart. As I mentioned, I was an Assistant Attorney General, but I also had the great honor to work in the White House under President Barack Obama, which was a wonderful opportunity for me. I was Senior Advisor for Jobs and Competitiveness in the Obama administration. I also went back into the federal government last year on day one of the Biden administration and helped to launch the Commerce Department as acting general counsel of the Commerce Department. We inherited a lot of really big challenges from the Trump administration. So for example, the Commerce Department oversees the census. And so when Trump mismanaged the census and tried to exclude a number of people from that count for politically motivated reasons, on day one of the Biden administration, we had to clean up some of that mess. And so I've had direct experience managing lawyers. There are about 400 lawyers in the U.S. Department of Commerce. It's a 50,000 person department with a $12 billion budget. Actually, it has a big footprint right here on Cape Cod because of NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, and some of the great work that's done in Woods Hole. And so the Commerce Department's a big entity.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
Wow. Part of hooey. That's great. Is there anything else that you would do with the office that's not being done now?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot that we can do. First of all, we've got the Supreme Court undermining our civil rights. It's been really upsetting to see the Dobbs decision, to see the Supreme Court undermining our role in cutting down on gun violence, undermining our ability to take on the climate crisis. And so I've got a lot of challenges in dealing with that set of changes on the legal level, at the federal government level. We've also got a democracy that's under attack. I feel like we're watching history unfold before our eyes with these January 6th hearings. But I think we're in a really scary moment with our democracy, and I think that a lot of the solutions to that are going to come from the state level. And then there's just a lot of opportunities to use the office to make people's lives better. I care a lot about trying to help make the economy work for everyone. Here on the Cape, we've got a big tourism industry, we've got fisheries, we've got a number of jobs that we need to make sure that the economy is working for everyone. We need to help small businesses, we need to help workers, and so the Attorney General's office plays a really big role in some of those issues.
Great. There seems to be a really clear divide between you and Andrea Campbell. You have fought for the people and stood up against big companies like Walmart, and Andrea is taking PAC money from them. Especially for Attorney General, that feels like a really important distinction. How would you continue to fight for the people when you're elected?
Yeah, so I think that keeping special interest money out of the Attorney General's office is really important. If you sort of think about the way that the Attorney General's role has been over the last few years, some of the things that we've done that have been most effective have been taking on Walmart, for example, for wage and hour violations, taking on ExxonMobil or taking on Purdue Pharma, some of the work that I did with insurance companies. And if you want the Attorney General to be able to play that role, you need to have the Attorney General be free of special interest money. So that's one of the reasons why I called for a people's pledge in this race. This goes back to an agreement that actually Scott Brown and Elizabeth Warren developed on a bipartisan basis about a decade ago to try and keep that special interest money out of this race. And I think it's really important for the people's lawyer to be able to take on special interests.
Definitely agree. Here in Bourne, we have two very concerning environmental things. We are looking both at Holtec, threatening to dump 1 million gallons of radioactive waste into Cape Cod Bay, it's on our north side, and the possibility of a wastewater outfall directly into the Cape Cod Canal, right near homes and beaches. What can you do to help us stop these potential environmental disasters?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking this question. The climate crisis is at the top of my agenda. I'm proud to have the support of Sierra Club and 350 Mass in this race. And we've talked a lot about the role of the Attorney General in fighting back against environmental hazards. In the Cape, we know that the economy and the environment are really interwoven.
Yes.
And a lot of the jobs here depend on us having a wonderful, pristine environment. And with Holtec, I've been, I literally stood with a bullhorn in my hand protesting against Holtec's plans to dump that radioactive water into the Cape Cod Bay. And I do think that there are some representations that Holtec has made to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that the Attorney General should hold them to. So I think we've got a real role for the state government, but we also can work with the federal government, with FERC, to make sure that they are not violating the pristine waters of Cape Cod, that they're not hurting the fishing industry and the tourism industry, and of course polluting our water. The outfalls is another example of where I think the Attorney General can really play a big role in fighting locally to protect our environment. And then I also would mention the Joint Base Cape Cod plans to put in place a machine gun range that could really impact our drinking water and wildlife. We know that this is a very delicate ecosystem.
Yes, it's
and
right on top of the aquifer. It's like,
yeah,
really?
And we know that military activity here dating back a number of years has had a detrimental impact on our drinking water and on shell fishing and other kinds of concerns. We don't need more of that pollution, and there are good alternatives for Joint Base Cape Cod or for the military to do the kind of training that they're talking about doing. And so I've been pushing really hard for them not to locate those training exercises right here. It's going to hurt Bourne and Falmouth and Sandwich, and it's a real concern.
I have a friend who lives basically adjacent to that, and the noise itself is going to be just unbearable.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. The other interesting thing on the Cape is we have a lot of seniors here. Seniors are retiring here. What can you do to protect seniors from scammers and other unscrupulous predators who feast on unsuspecting seniors?
Yeah, thanks for that question, because it's a really key role for the Attorney General's office to stand up for consumers, particularly senior citizens, to use our unfair and deceptive trade practices laws. We have really strong laws to protect seniors. I did that kind of work directly when I was an Assistant Attorney General, investigating and suing companies that were scamming seniors or were making misrepresentations, doing unfair things, and I think that's a really important role. It's also, as I mentioned, healthcare is an area of expertise, an area of interest for me. I think in the healthcare sector, seniors pay too much for medicines. Healthcare costs are too high, and so I'd like to use some of the powers of the AG office to stand up for seniors. in the context of drugs or medicines, in the context of insurance, and also rent. Rent is too high. Housing costs are very high on Cape Cod and the islands, and the Attorney General's office can play a really big role in standing up for tenants, standing up for borrowers, and trying to use the tools of the office to make sure that that borrowers and tenants get a fair shake and that we keep those housing costs as low as we can.
What can you do about housing? Because here on the Cape, it's not just seniors, but even teachers, firefighters, medical workers, they can't afford to live here. I don't know what's going to happen to our community if we don't have those people here. What exactly can you do to help that?
Yeah, so the Attorney General's office is really the people's lawyer in that kind of context. When there was the mortgage foreclosure crisis, for example, we sued a lot of those predatory lenders and those big banks, and then took some of the recoveries from that to try and deal with some of the underlying problems. So sometimes you sue a big bank or you sue a bunch of developers or landlords, and then you get some recoveries that you can use to help people afford the housing or to deal with that underlying problem. But we're really in a good position to stand up for individual borrowers and tenants. For some of the bigger problems, we're going to need to work with the governor, with the legislature, to try to increase the housing stock, maybe put in place some rent stabilization, some of those kinds of tools that I think could help a lot. So we can be part of that bigger problem. But our real role is as an advocate for tenants and for borrowers and for consumers.
Let's go back to your work with the Build Back Better, which is somewhat reduced now, but at least it got passed. What can you tell me about that? How would you influence that bill?
Yeah, so at the beginning of the Biden administration, we both had to deal with a lot of the messes that we'd inherited from the Trump administration. And we also wanted to move forward with a bold agenda for making an economy that works for everyone. Some of that came out immediately with some of the first set of recovery monies that are now finding their way into Massachusetts, some of that infrastructure money. But some of that is this bill that hopefully the president's going to sign in the next couple of days, which are going to help bring down drug costs, and that's going to be a really important measure for seniors. It's going to allow Medicare to negotiate with those drug companies, bring down some of those prices. It's going to create really big incentives for some reforms that are going to help with the climate crisis. It's going to make it cheaper to buy an electric car. It's going to make it cheaper to put solar panels on our houses. It's going to help electrify the grid. It's actually going to be the biggest piece of climate legislation in the history of any country. And so this is a big step forward. I spend a lot of time talking about how Congress doesn't work very well, but this is one where I got to hand it to them. If the Democrats in Congress can get this bill through, it's going to help a lot of people with some of the pain of inflation and some of the economic pain, but it's also going to really help our environment.
Okay, I mean, I'm interested in getting an electric car. I'm not sure I could find one, and then where, if I drove 300 miles, where would I get to charge it? Are they going to be working on those things?
All of those problems are sort of structural problems that we need to fix in the system. So it shouldn't be cheaper to buy a Honda Civic or a Toyota Corolla than a Leaf or a car that's electrified. And so one of the things this bill is going to do is have some tax incentives that are going to flip that a little bit. Then, as you say, you need to make sure that it's possible to plug it in someplace, right? And then the other thing is that when you're plugging it in, you're getting electricity from the grid. Well, if the electricity from the grid is mostly from fossil fuels, then you're actually not improving the environmental impact as much as we want to. So what we want to do is really invest in solar and wind and geothermal and truly renewable sources of energy, and make sure that the mix of energy that's in the grid is actually going to be renewable. And so both at the federal level with this bill, and actually Beacon Hill is about to get something right on that, I hope, and pass some incentives for renewable sources of energy, have a little more wind, a little more solar, and really build some of those jobs too, because one of the nice things about clean and renewable energy is that we can do well by doing good, if that makes sense. The things that are going to be really good for fighting the climate crisis are going to create really good jobs and really good sectors for our economy. And we're competing right now with China on on those clean and renewable energy sources. And if we can invest in wind and in solar, that's going to help us competitively and get good jobs for the future right here.
That's wonderful. Do you have anything in the AG's office? Do you have anything about education?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. So this is an issue that I care about a lot because it feels to me like we're failing to provide a free and appropriate public education for every child. We're almost 70 years after Brown versus Board of Education. There's still a lot of segregation in our schools, still a lot of differences between the opportunities that we give to kids depending on where they grow up. And I think we need to invest in our public schools. I really oppose the expansion of charter schools and receivership. So that's been a big difference in this race between me and Andrea Campbell. But I also am a big supporter of the Fair Share Amendment, which is going to take a little bit of money from the very, very wealthiest people. I think there's a lot of misinformation about who this is going to affect. It's really only going to affect people making millions every year, not just their overall wealth, right? Well, but what that's going to do is it's going to create some resources so that we can invest in transportation and in education. And transportation is a real problem all across the state. It's too hard to move around on the Cape and the islands. Within Boston, we're seeing trains on fire. They're shutting down the Orange Line. And so we need more resources for transportation, and we need more resources for education so that every child gets a good start in life, more early childhood education, and I'd love to bring down the cost of college and get rid of some of that student loan debt as well. So.
Is there any way to cut the student loan by cutting the interest rates that they have to pay? Because that's where it really seems to get crazy.
Yeah, I'm a proud alum of the Biden administration, but I'd love to see a little bit more action on the federal level to forgive student loan debt and also to deal with some of those interest rates. We also have to deal with the rising cost of college. I think that it should be free, but certainly we've got to rein in those costs. The Attorney General's office does play a big role in being an advocate for borrowers and standing up against lenders who mistreat students. There's a student loan ombudsman program in the office to help navigate some of those issues. But college and higher education costs too much. That debt follows people around. With younger people, it often constrains their life choices. So people wait to have a family, to buy a home. But I also see seniors who are retiring with student loan debt that's hanging around their heads.
Really? Wow.
And as the parent of young children, you also are trying to figure out how are you going to help them afford higher education. So it's really, I think, burdening a lot of people. So I think we need to do a lot more to make higher education affordable and also to relieve the burden of that student loan debt.
That's great. One of the things that is a real big concern here on the Cape is the bridges. When you talk about transportation, you came over the bridge. I don't know how long it took you, but we are talking about replacing both bridges. I don't know if it's going to be done in my lifetime, maybe. But here in Bourne, we're particularly concerned because of the access roads, not just the bridge itself, but all the access roads that have to be redone. And we really need to have a seat at the table. Does the AG have anything to do with this?
Yeah, I think that the Attorney General's office can be sort of an advocate for local communities in a lot of conversations. And certainly if we're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on infrastructure projects, we need to make sure that there are community voices at the table. There is a lot of new federal infrastructure money, so we want to spend it in a way that really helps build the economy and make people be able to move around more easily. There's a real justice aspect to how we spend transportation money. Right. And so I think the Attorney General's office can make sure that community voices are heard in those conversations.
That would be great. Another sort of something that's very close to my heart is public libraries. I am the chair of the Bourne Board of Trustees for the library, and we have found that getting money for repairs or building a new library is so burdensome. It takes decades to get. There is some money, but it is a small pot of money for a very long list. Is there anything the AG can do to help us with that?
So I love libraries.
Yeah.
I have 3 kids, 13, 11, and 5, and we spend a lot of time in public libraries, and I think it's a wonderful community resource. And, so I think that, I'd love to help sort of lift up that question. A lot of that is, going to be handled by the governor and the legislature, but certainly I think there's a real public good element to public libraries, and that we don't appreciate the treasures that they are.
That's true. That's very true. So, Quentin, tell me, why should we vote for you?
So I think that the voters have good choices in this race, but I think there are 3 things that set me apart. And the first is my experience. I think that having direct experience in the Attorney General's office as an Assistant Attorney General, as Chief of the Healthcare Division, my experience managing almost 400 lawyers in the U.S. Department of Commerce. This is a very hard job, and it would be a hard job to do as your first job in government or your first job of this type.
Yes.
We need an Attorney General who's ready on day one to take on those challenges. I'm also proud to have the endorsement of the Democratic Party in this race, and I think that part of that is because there are really big policy differences. I'm going to stand up for single-payer health care, for safe injection sites, for a cap on charter school, for fare-free transit, for police accountability, for rent control and clean elections. Those are all issues where there are differences with Andrea Campbell, for example, in this race, and I think those progressive values set me apart. And then finally, there's a question of standing up to special interests. We need an Attorney General who's a clean elections candidate, who's really standing up for the people and not beholden to big corporations or the establishment. And I think that we have this notion of the Attorney General as being sort of our lawyer, the people's lawyer. And I think that I'm the one who's best situated to do that role.
Wow, that's just wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Quentin, and best of luck in the primary, which is September 6th, yes, the day after Labor Day. Please, if you're watching this on Born TV, you can see this and my other interviews on borntv.com. Please watch, meet the candidates, and you be the judge. Get out and vote. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, and people can come to www.quentinpalfrey.com to get involved in the campaign.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.